communicate easily and immediately in a fast way. That's the best way to do that. Emails are time consuming. Anyway, I haven't got the link, so
The link is
Send
yeah,
send
that's
yes.
this.
the okay.
Whoa, so many people here.
All right. Um, yes, there is nobody there, so we come back to. All right.
This week, I will create a WhatsApp group and send the link to you, Professor, so you can share with our students, and maybe we could align this better for the next week to avoid these
Yes,
issues.
yes. For some reason, people are not joining us. We have only 8 students, but anyway, let's move to the presentation here. Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, I can. From my end.
Yes, sim.
Yes. Okay. There we go. So, and this second lecture, we'll begin to discuss how is the geological background of Brazil and Africa. And I have 2 separate lectures. In the first lecture today, we are going to discuss the Brazilian case study, okay? And then in this picture that you can see here, you have the top mountain of Gandarela Highlands in um, in Minas Gerais, where we have the deepest regolith in Brazil, reaching 450 meters deep, with an age of 90 million years age. We only have regoliths older than 90 million years age in Australia and South Africa. So this is probably one of the oldest weathering mantles in our planet, reaching almost half a kilometer deep regolith, which is iron rich and is mined for iron in our state, Minas Gerais state. This is what we call the critical zone. So we're going to present you what is the continuous
Somewhere,
of
Simeon, come and join this class.
rock weathering profile
Simeon.
and soils. When we talk about soils and when we talk about rocks, there is a big problem for students to understand, because here where I'm touching the mounds, okay, you can follow the contact between the saprolite, this yellowish clear zone here in the bottom, and the reddish soils on the top of that. And the age is a big problem because we have an A horizon here under the vegetation, savanna vegetation, which got a carbon dating of 1,000 years, very recent. This reddish horizon, what we call the B horizon, is a latosol, an oxisol, which got an age of 8,000 years. So it's older than the A horizon. But the saprolite underneath these soils has got something in this place, something like 160 meters deep. And the age of these saprolite range for 15 to 23 million years. And below 160 meters, we have the rock, the bedrock, as is like gneiss, and this gneiss would have 2,600,000,000 years of age. So it's all in a single picture, and you can have all this age in the same picture, in the same photograph. So it is very difficult for the students to understand that this material, which is the weathered rock, is much older than the soils on the top of that. And this is what we call the entire sequence of A horizon, B horizon, saprolite, and rock, what we call the critical zone. And why is the critical zone? Because it is where the chemical, physical, climatic, biological processes occur. And this is why it's so important to understand that. The spirit of our lecture is to understand what is the geological, geomorphological controls on the nature of tropical critical zone as a whole, Brazil, Australia, Africa, everything. Then we are going to put an emphasis on the regolith orange, the biotic, and the petronomorphological interplays, and how the critical zone will represent the balance between the regolith production by weathering and, of course, long-term erosion of surface process that would eventually remove the regolith by erosion. Then we have what we call the long-term biological reactor of the tropics. And I'm going to give you an example of of an scheme, and in this scheme you can see how during the different times A, B, C, D, it's a time log scale, which means that each letter here is a thousand, a million, a billion years. So it is a sequence of progressive logarithmic time. So in the very beginning of the weathering, where rock is exposed to tropical climate, there is a very strong production of phytomass and biomass by animals, together with intensive leaching, regolith formation, and the action of termites, termitofauna here. As time goes, then we have a phase in which clay minerals of 2:1 and progressively 1:1, the removal of silicon from the system will decrease the rate of biomass production, but it's still high, and will, of course, increase the atmospheric input of aerosols. And these aerosols will be almost stable throughout the time because the wind will get particulate materials continuously without depending on, of course, on the water available in the system. So aerosols will be constant, almost constant throughout the time. And with time, we reach a condition what we call million of years from C to D. After million of years, then you have a residual material, which is basically formed by kaolinite, 1:1 clays, and particularly iron and aluminum hydroxide. And when we reach to that point, the regolith formation is decreased because it is almost stable. It gets to a depth of hundreds of meters. And what we see is that the termitofauna, the termites, which is very efficient for dealing with little nutrient poor soils and regolith, will begin to have a prominent role in the tropical system, together with the additions of aerosols. This is very important because we have very low production of biomass, with very, very low erosion because the weathering mantle is very deep, and we have little leaching because most of the soluble product, calcium, magnesium, potassium, has been leached and removed. So in the end, what's happening is that the two factors that dominate the tropical zone will be termite efficiency, the only animal that could be responsible for intense biomass production under conditions of low nutrient availability. On the other hand, the aerosols begin to have is very, very intense. And in the tropics, we have this critical zone, very deep critical zone in three situations: Brazil, Australia, and Africa. And the regolith would include not only the saprolite, but also the soil at the surface. And the internal structure of the regolith will define the flow of waters. So how water would infiltrate and percolate in this structure. Brazilian critical zone has the deepest and the oldest regolith, together with Australia and South Africa. And the fresh rocks, the bedrocks, have long been transformed into a steady state weathered mantle. So again, regolith is everything in between the fresh rock and the fresh air. It will include the weathered rock, eruptive volcanic material, sediment, air in gases, water and soil, and the vegetation, the biota. Okay? So this is the regolith, and it shows here that the regolith is alive in the top of that and will decrease the living organism, the presence of living organisms as you move down. But the science has demonstrated that even in the saprolite, if you take a gram of saprolite from 100 meters down and you incubate that in the lab, there will be some microorganism that will be present there. And of course, these organisms, they do not depend on light, but they depend on water. So they will be in this dark medium, which we call the saprolite. And these organisms will be responsible for the progressive weathering of this low base of weathering limit between the rock and the regolith. Okay, and then there is a line of water table which varies according to the climate, and rivers are just the outcrop of this water table at the bottom landscape. So the amount of water that flows superficially across the landscape will depend eventually on the amount of water present in the water table, and of course, the height of this water table. The height will define the degree of incision, okay? So when you look at the tropical landscape, you can clearly see that water moves through the regolith and forms a continuous deposit of water-saturated regolith, which is what we call the water table, the first water table. I'll give you an example of the famous Fundão disaster, where we have this critical zone here. This is the original valley before the mining occurred there in Mariana, near the city of Viçosa, where we have one of the largest dam for tailings coming from the iron mining area. And we have here the construction of this dam, which would be at that time something like 100 meters high. Then they have put another 15 meters higher than the original dam, and put another extra load of tailings. You can see the tailing here in another dam here. So we have this dam and we have another dam here. And what happened is all of a sudden, this elevation of the dam did not support. And what happened, I made a study on that. You can see that there is, in the first picture, the original picture, I can follow the drainage line here. Drainage line. It will eventually stop here, the drainage line, original drainage line. And what happened is that precisely this drainage line was exhumed. It was resuscitated from the erosion of the big dam here. So we've showed that when you have a drainage line which is occluded, which is taken over by tailings, depending on the amount of water that runs underneath, it will put an enormous pressure on these dam structures at a specific point. And the failure happened exactly here at the middle, where we have originally the river crossing the valley of these mountains. So this hanging valley was just exhumed because the water wanted to have free flowing and it could not free flow because of this damming. So that's something that we have to consider, how the critical zones behave. It is not homogeneous, it has localized pressure, and this leads to these accidents and problems that we find in our tropical zone. So where is the regolith? We have very little mapping of these. I have made a mapping of regolith in Brazil, a preliminary map, but you can have these very general maps of regolith where you have the amount of silicon removal. So you have less removal, like in the hyperarid, with very little chemical weathering. And we have that here in the Kalahari, in the Sahara Desert, in the Saudi Arabia, in Central Asia. And we also have in South America, here in the Atacama Desert. Okay? Then you move to another area where we have transitional zone, climatically speaking, and you have this smectitization, which is the formation of 2-to-1 clays, very rich chemically. Then transitional, the Sahelian zone in Africa. So if you move to North Nigeria, if you go to Ethiopia, if you go to North Benin, we will have this smectitization. So chemical rich soil. Yeah? So there are soils which are chemically rich and they can stand cultivation, continuous cultivation for longer time, but they had problems with water availability because it is a transitional zone between the desert and the savanna. Then you have the savanna soils and the savanna regolith, what will make of kaolinite, of 1-to-1 clay with very little nutrients retained. So these are nutrient poor regoliths. And in the end, we have the halitization, which is the highest level of weathering, Central Africa, Amazonia, and here in Southeast Asia. So we have here the highest degree of regolith formation, moving towards what I showed you before, this level here, this phase 1-to-1 iron and aluminum hydroxide, with very little nutrients to be cycled. Okay. So there is no precise mapping of regolith. Let's move to the macro scale of the geology of South America to understand how the bedrock is. Then this division gives us a picture of three basic areas of important areas in Brazil. One is the stable and very old shield, what we call the craton, these vertical lines. Then we have these dotted areas, which are sedimentary basins. And then we have the mobile belt of volcanic and tectonic folding forming the Andes Mountains, where we have earthquakes, volcanoes, active movements. So this is a tectonically active boundary between South American plate and the Pacific. Moving towards Brazil, then we can divide the old areas in two different sectors. One is the first one is the oldest one that we call the Amazon Craton, and the San Francisco Craton here. These are the old cratonic rocks, and they being exposed in the last 300 million years continuously. Very old rocks. These rocks are older than 2 billion years. Then we have these violet areas, which is called the mobile belts. And these mobile belts, Northeast, Brazilian mobile belt, Atlantic mobile belt, they are forming the folded and faulted rocks around the solid shield of the San Francisco. Why happened that? Because in the last collision between Brazil and Africa, these areas were extremely formed by the collision, by tectonic collision. And eventually we have the yellowish areas in Brazil which form the sedimentary basins. They are also old, they are also poor. So in Brazil, we have poor rocks in more than 80% of these old rocks, and we have more than 85% of rock in the yellow sedimentary basin. So deep weathering is everywhere in Brazil. It's very interesting, but in the same way as we have in Africa, the cratons, the old rocks, the old basement rocks, they will form lowland areas with flat, stable landform. So if you go to the Amazonia, if you go to the mid San Francisco River, you can see that there is a trend of extensive flat areas where we have these old rocks. And why it is flat and why it is low in altitude? This is because they have not been subject to tectonic movements of recent age. So they are stable. They are landform with a long time of stable development. On the other hand, we can find the mobile belts here related to the highland areas of reactivated movement with a greater diversity of landform. This is our mountain range, our serras, our plateaus. They are related to the three mobile belts, Atlantic, Brazilian, and Northeast. And eventually, the sedimentary basin will form the high flat plateau in the sedimentary rocks, where we have horizontal bedding of the sediment and we have the horizontal landforms of the plateau. So there is an agreement with this horizontal structure, okay? I will not get into detail of the different types of rocks and the age that we have in our sedimentary base. You can see that sedimentary basins are very different. We have different basins here in Amazon and Paraná. So we have different types of rocks associated with each one of these sedimentary basins. I'm going to translate that for you. I have that translated. This is in Portuguese, but I have a grouping of rocks associated with erosion problems and chemical problems. In the same groups of rocks can be interpreted in the same way for Africa. So this table is very useful because it can give you what's the problem in terms of chemical richness and chemical poverty of these different rocks in the tropical zone. Okay, I'll give you a translation of that so you can understand. later on. So what is Brazil? Brazil is a very old geological structure with a long-term critical zone evolution. The two stable cratons, the Amazonas and São Francisco, they were formed before 2 billion years of age, very old crust, stable, and they are eroded to the roots. The tremobile belts are metamorphic rocks intensively faulted around the cratons. Then they will form in between 2 billion and 600 million years of age. So they form the Brazilian Northeast and Atlantic mobile belts. And then we have the three sedimentary basins. They are of Paleozoic age, so we have an age in between 600 million and 200 million years ago. And they form a Pangea cycle when all continents formed a single big continent in this planet, joining Brazil, Africa, India, Antarctica, Australia, Madagascar, in a single continent. At that time, we had a shallow seas that now form the sediments of Maranhão, Amazonas, and Paraná sedimentary basin. And after the separation between Brazil and Africa, which happened in the last 200 millions, we have the formation of the oil-rich basin along the coast, the coastal basin, which is very important for Brazil and Africa in terms of oil production. That is why Nigeria has got a lot of oil in relation to what we call the equatorial zone in Brazil. We have oil here, Africa has got oil there. And you move to Gabon, where you have a lot of oil, and in Gabon, we have the same match between the oil that we found in Salvador, in Bahia state. As you move down, you can have oil basins in Rio de Janeiro, in the Campos Basin, which matches the other basin, the other side of the Atlantic in Angola. So the same oil that was generated when Africa and Brazil were close to each other, then we have now oil being explored in both sides of the Atlantic. Because when Africa and South America separated, each part would get part of the basin, sedimentary basin, where oil is located. I'm going to give you a better look at the soil in the lecture about soils in Brazil, but I have to say that in the Amazon craton soils, less than 1.5% are eutrophic. What is an eutrophic soil? A rich soil, a soil which has got high calcium, high magnesium, high phosphorus, high potassium. So this is very, very little rich soils in the Amazon. Whereas almost 98.5% is very poor, nutrient poor soils, and they are related to deep regolith. Don't mind the table. I'm going to explain that in the soil lecture. Just to give an idea how it is, the Amazon craton is a stable structure, like here. This is a cut that I made, the Amazon craton, which rocks, very old rocks with 2 billion years. And this, in the top of that, we have this sedimentary basin, which is called the Amazon Sedimentary Basin. Okay, so all these soils here, ranging from the mountains, from the southern Amazonia to the northern Amazonia, are dystrophic, all dystrophic. We only have euteric soils, rich soils here along the margins of the Amazon River. Apart from that, we have nutrient poor soils everywhere. So what we call the Amazon forest occurs regardless of the nutrient availability. So it is a forest created by nutrient cycle in a long-term basis, very long-term, okay? And when you look at the sedimentary basin of the Amazon, you can see that it is divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sectors, separated by arch. And what is an arch here? An arch is a folding of the sedimentary basin in a way that it creates something like a dam, something like a resistant rock underneath the sediments. So these arch, they are created by the tectonic collision and between Brazil and Pacific. So when the Andes Mountains were built up, the resulting effect here in the Paleozoic basin of the Amazon was precisely this formation of waves, foldings that define the arch. And these arches separate different sectors of the basin. So the Acre Basin is something different from the Upper Solimões, from the Mid-Amazon Valley, from the Low Amazon and the Marajó. So each basin has got sediment which are specific to each sector. So this is very interesting because we have no uniform composition. When we move to the São Francisco Craton and the surrounding mobile belts here, Atlantic, Brasilia, and Northeast, we have the deepest regolith along the edge, okay? And deep weathering is everywhere is deep weathering. So even it's the yellowish color here, which is limestone, these limestones here are so weathered that there is very little calcareous rock on the top of the surface because it's been totally transformed. This is why soils here are nutrient poor, regardless, independent of the parent rock, okay? And what another interesting thing is that because of the deepest regolith, we have the highest mineral concentration. So what is insoluble remains in the regolith. And what is insoluble, for instance? Let me give you an example. Copper, gold, platinum, silver. So all these things are very little soluble. So they have very low solubility. So they concentrate in the weathering profile. This is why the regolith and the critical zone, Brazil and Africa, they are mineral rich because they have concentration of insoluble metals. And here we have a cross along the São Francisco Craton, and we have more than 250 meters of regolith, ranging in age of 15 to 30 million in this part. Here in the mountains, we have more than 400 meters regolith, and it goes to ages nearly 100 million years old. all these soils, all soils here, are nutrient poor, very poor. A typical picture of the horizontal bedding of the sedimentary basin that form the high tablelands, what we call chapadões, the high tablelands, the very flat landforms. They are inherited from the horizontal bedding. This is an example of Upper Paranaíba, where we have this planation surface still preserved. So the river are there, and we have another important aspect, which is the subsurface water in this sandstone here. So there is a huge aquifer, there is a huge water resource beneath the soils in the critical zone, because by water as you move down. So this is giant aquifers that in Brazil we are beginning to take up this water for irrigation, for the cities, for human consumption. Limestone in Brazil, not in Africa. In Africa they are very common, but in Brazil they are rare, they are deeply weathered, and we have very few fresh outcrops. Okay, so when you see the outcrops of calcareous rocks in Brazil, they are very small, and as you move down the small mountains, you can have these weathered mantles with bits and pieces of limestone in the middle of deep weathering. So this is what we have under a very wet and tropical climate in Brazil. I'm not going to discuss the soils today, but I have to say that the same happened in the Paleozoic basin. So we have poor soils, very poor soils in the Paleozoic basin. And why is that? Because as I mentioned, we have very little limestone, and we have a lot of sandstone here and pellite. So let's take the Paraná Paleozoic basin. It's a giant water reservoir because this sandstone will allow the water to percolate down and to concentrate something like 300, 500, 1,000 meters down the sedimentary basins. So this is this type of sedimentary basin that we find in Brazil. And just to give you an idea that these original marine sediments are now forming high plateaus because the inversion of relief. In the Paleozoic, it was a marine basin, but now they are highlands because of the collision between Brazil and Africa that moved this sedimentary basin to the top. This is what we call the relief inversion. Let's have a look of the metals that have been concentrated by weathering in Brazil. I'll just take two examples. One is aluminum, the blue square here. This blue square is bauxite, aluminum-rich regolith. Brazil has got the highest bauxite, aluminum-rich regolith, together with Canada, Africa, and Australia. And this one here is the biggest one in Pará. Let's take another look of this yellowish metal, which is gold. So this is gold, and you can see the gold is everywhere in Brazil. But it's particularly concentrated in the margin of the Amazon basin. This area where I'm passing the mouse here is the highest gold concentration which can be found anywhere on planet Earth. We have so much gold here that it is very difficult to control the low scale mining by mining people, what we call garimpeiros, people who work with gold extraction in a very low technology basis, okay, because of this abundance of gold. But we also have another element which is crucial for development, which is these red, dark red areas, which is iron. And again, Brazil has got two big, very big iron concentrated mining areas. And this is Carajás. This is the biggest area of iron mining on planet Earth. And the second one is the Quadrilátero Ferrífero in Minas Gerais. So we have iron, gold, and aluminum as a good example of minerals being concentrated by weathering, and we take the weathering mantle, the regolith, as a resource for development. And you can see a list of minerals like copper, tin, manganese, niobium, titanium. So we have a lot of different minerals which can be found in Brazil, and these are related to the measuring of this regolith. Just a moment, please. I'll take some water for me. Great.
Okay, Professor.